Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to this week's webcast with our founder and president, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Today is December 6th, 2018. There's a wealth of developments following the G20 summit. There's a series of shocks being delivered in Europe. We're seeing the financial system in a highly volatile state. But I think, Helga, we should start with the situation in Europe because most Americans are only hearing a little bit about this. They can't put together the whole picture, but I think you have a good handle on it. So why don't we start with France? What's happening with Macron and the situation in France?
Well, as people may have noticed, there was these demonstrations and blockades since 2 weeks of the so-called yellow vests. Now, this led to some significant violence in Paris, with the Arc de Triomphe, being attacked and many cars being smashed and windows. But these violent excesses are not typical for this process which is going on in France. It's just some provocateurs which immerse themselves into this ferment, which can only be described as a mass strike ferment of the normal, mainly rural French population of the provinces. These are people who are workers, who are truckers, who are farmers, fishermen, who, despite a lot of hard work, can't make ends meet. And they have started this process against the threat to have an increase of the oil and gasoline prices and general fuel prices. But in the meantime, in the last 2 weeks, this has transformed itself completely, where Macron, who first tried to ignore it, but then he had realized he had to capitulate, so he postponed any such changes for first half a year, then a year. But this did not stop this process at all, because in the meantime, those people demonstrating, which are supported by 80% of the Frenchmen, they started to realize that there is a much more fundamental question, namely, where is society going? That a policy which is only made for the very rich must stop, and that a much more fundamental transformation is what is required. Now, this is a big thing. This is not just some provocateurs, but this is the majority of the French population. And the most dramatic thing I think becomes clear is that the police trade union declared full solidarity with the strikers, and they will have an unrestricted or not limited strike starting on December 8th. And that day will also be another nationwide big blockade and demonstration. And there was some discussion if the government should reintroduce martial law, which they had for a while because of these terrorist attacks. And it was strongly argued against it, because as the police, the likelihood that the army would take the side of the yellow vests is very great, because these are also people who have families, who have brothers, who have uncles, nephews, sisters. And therefore, when you come to a point when a government no longer can use the police and the army to quell such a protest, then you are normally talking about the loss of power. Now, we're obviously not yet completely at that point, but this is in the air. And I think this is a sign of the time that the kind of neoliberal order, which resulted in the Brexit vote 2 years ago, which then led to the election of President Trump, it led to the election victory of the Italian government. And now it obviously has reached France. It's already going into Belgium. It just is a reflection that obviously the populations in these countries is no longer willing to accept a neoliberal order which is so fundamentally going against the interest of its own people.
And we see, you mentioned Brexit as an early example of this. Theresa May is still trying to finagle something on Brexit, but it looks as though she's in big trouble as part of the same insurgency, isn't she?
Well, she just lost an election in the parliament. This election was not about the Brexit deal with the EU as such, but it was about May's effort to keep the text of that deal secret. Now, that would have meant that the parliamentarians would have to vote on something they could not even read. And naturally, this was rejected. It was rejected with the additional vote of, I think, 26 or even more of the Tory, her own party, and 9 out of 10 of the Democratic Union Party of Northern Ireland. So her coalition is in shambles. And next Tuesday, there will be the actual vote on the Brexit, and the likelihood that she will lose that is very high. Now, what will happen then is an open question. She could be replaced by, some other Tory like Boris Johnson or some other not so good solution. It could also be that it leads to new elections and that the Labour Party and Corbyn could win that. But then naturally, Corbyn has a more reasonable program. He wants to reindustrialize Great Britain, and in general, he has a completely different policy. But that still then leaves the open question: what will happen to the derivative markets of the City of London, which is one of the huge bubbles? And if there is an uncontrolled Brexit, then all hell could break loose in an already extremely volatile financial system. So, this is a very dramatic moment, and people should become active with the Schiller Institute, because only if you implement New Bretton Woods and the general reforms my husband has demanded in the 4 laws, Glass-Steagall, National Bank, credit system, cooperation in a new paradigm, only if you have this totality of the package can you avoid a disaster. But this is really a transformation. As we have said many times, we are really experiencing the end of an epoch and the emergence of a new one. How the new one will look like, it is not yet decided and not clear, but it's one of these, what Schiller would call pregnant moments in history, where the subjective intervention is what really makes the difference.
Well, another part of this end of an epoch is going to be the meeting tomorrow in Hamburg, where the Christian Democrats in Germany will be selecting a new president of the CDU. The rebellion has not yet fully struck Germany, other than in a voter discontent with all the parties. Do you see anything positive coming out of this CDU conference tomorrow, or is it going to take something else to shift the situation in Germany?
Well, I'm not so optimistic, because the present main candidates, there are some others who may have better ideas. They have not yet been portrayed sufficiently in the press that I would know about it. But the 3 dominant candidates, Friedrich Merz, who has not said anything yet, which would convince me that he's not a complete representative of the neoliberal, neoconservative transatlantic establishment, naturally the kinds of policies which are really the cause of the problem. And it's unfortunate that he is supported by the CDU Economic Council, CDU Wirtschaftsrat, because obviously people there think that he is more competent in terms of economic questions. But there is a big difference if you are competent in terms of the financial markets and the speculative side of the system, or if you are competent in terms of the real economy. And that is unfortunately not going in that direction at all. On the other side, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, AKK as she is called, she has said some pretty provocative things which are also strategically stupid. Namely that, in the context of this whole Ukraine crisis, that if it could be proven that Russia is responsible, then NATO should immediately block Russian ships everywhere. I mean, that's a kind of Cold War talk, which is really not any help at all. And Jens Spahn is one of these typical health economists. And, he has also extremely austere economic visions. as I said, there are other candidates, but they are not being played up by the media. In general, I don't think that there is anything positive coming. And even if this whole thing would lead to new elections, which, if Merz would become the new chairman of the CDU, he could want to trigger an early demise of Merkel as a chancellor. But with the present spectrum of politics in Germany, except of the BÜSO and except of Schiller Institute, there is really nobody who presents the kinds of solutions where Germany would work together with the countries of Russia, China, the United States, and the new paradigm of the Silk Road. So, the German situation, in my view, remains the biggest dark hole in the whole situation.
Well, one of the better situations in Europe, so that the people can see that it's not all dark, is Italy, where the Italians are continuing a diplomatic offensive, an economic offensive, intervention in the U.S. Congress. Where is that heading in Italy now?
Oh, that's really the irony of the situation, that Italy, which is being attacked so much by the mainstream media, right now is the only stable government in Europe, unlike Germany, France, and Great Britain. Maybe also Spain could be called relatively stable. But Italy is doing good things. There was just an extremely important delegation of Marco Zanni, who is a member of the European Parliament, and Michele Geraci, who is the deputy commerce minister. They were in Washington and they had meetings with the Trump administration and also members of Congress to discuss Glass-Steagall, to discuss joint European American economic programs for Africa. So there is actually a very useful discussion, which is what should happen. And it is quite interesting that this Italian government is positive towards Trump, towards Russia, and towards China. And naturally, this is to the dismay of the EU bureaucracy. But one could only hope that this kind of reasonable international cooperation would spread to other countries. It has actually spread already, but obviously the three big ones, it has not yet touched in the same way.
Well, last week we were talking about the upcoming G20 conference that took place over the weekend. I think there's an interesting thing to look at there, which is that one of the few things they did do as the G20 was reconfirm by 19 of the 20 countries the commitment to the Paris climate change protocols. Donald Trump was the one leader who rejected that. But then immediately afterwards, as we were talking at the top of the program, the French voters rejected Macron, who was using the climate change issue to raise the taxes on fossil fuels. So at least the French people are on the right side on that one. But there was something very significant that did occur, actually two things. One, the meeting between Putin and Trump was disrupted by a combination of the Ukraine crisis, the provocation by Poroshenko, and secondly by Mueller. However, there was a very successful meeting between the Chinese and the United States, Trump and Xi. What's your report on that, Helga?
Well, there was this summit between the two presidents and some other members of their delegations, and both sides characterized the outcome as extremely positive, constructive. They agreed upon a truce concerning the tariffs. So the present tariffs will not be increased from 10 to 25% at the beginning of the next year, which was the perspective hanging over the whole situation. But they will try to work out a comprehensive approach in the next 90 days and maybe abandon these tariffs altogether by finding other ways to reduce the trade deficit between the United States and China, by China importing more products from the United States, agricultural products and other things. And so this is actually very good, because the rapport between President Trump and President Xi have been re-established. And this is, one of the absolute preconditions, given the fact that China and the United States are the two most important countries, in the sense that one is the strongest economy and developed country, and the other one is the strongest, not only developing country, but in the meantime, spokes country for the developing sector. So if these two countries are working together, it is extremely important for world peace and world stability. And also the fact that, there was an unbelievable provocation, a double provocation in the days before the Putin-Trump summit could occur. This has not yet been, finalized, because as Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, correctly said, that the Ukraine crisis, this attempt by Poroshenko to provoke Russia to, by sending Ukrainian ships from the Black Sea into the Sea of Azov unannounced on a secret mission, and thereby, provoking Russia to detain some of these Ukrainian sailors. This was clearly meant, to cause a freak out, to prevent the summit Trump-Putin. But at the same time, as you said, Mueller escalated the campaign against the environment of Trump, Manafort and Roger Stone, and basically creating an environment where Trump obviously felt that he could not meet with Putin, because the Russiagate, the anti-Russia hysteria in the United States was just cooked up to a cooking point. So, this unfortunately led to the fact that they did not meet, which is unfortunate. But that Mueller is not successful, at least at this point, you can see by the fact that Trump sent out a tweet afterwards, which, caused quite a freak out, namely that he said that he can see that in the future there will be an agreement between Putin, Xi Jinping, and himself about a comprehensive new arms control system. And that caused, all the neocons to go up in the air and say, this is dangerous, this is high risky. And Trump also talked about that the US military budget had now reached 716 billion, and this was crazy. So this was in the tweet. So people completely on the neocon side lost their nerve about that. But there was an interesting article in Forbes magazine which described that Trump obviously has learned a lot in the last 2 years, that he realized that there is a real serious arms race already going on, which is counterproductive and doesn't help any of the countries participating in it, and then there must be an effort to overcome it. So all the people who are normally completely losing their nerve when you mention the word Trump should really look at what is the intention of Trump, what comes out in terms of his policies again and again, and what is the effort by the neocons to prevent him from doing that. And if you don't make that differentiation, you are completely missing the boat about how politics works on a strategic level right now. And you tend to go on the wrong side in the anti-Trump, anti-Putin, anti-Xi Jinping frenzy. And that is actually where the war danger comes from.
And as you've been emphasizing, this tweet where Trump talks about getting together with Xi Jinping and Putin is moving toward the four-party agreement, which is also necessary for a new Bretton Woods. Now, the other thing that, if you go back to the beginning, the discussion of the problems in Europe, and you mentioned we're seeing an end of the neocon, neoliberal world order. There were two interesting aspects of that this week. You might say it was symbolic that George Herbert Walker Bush died, as this order that he was calling for is crashing. On the other hand, Secretary of State Pompeo gave a speech basically calling for Bush's New World Order when he spoke in Brussels. So I guess, Helga, this is the clash we see between these two systems, these two views.
Yeah, this Pompeo speech, again, is worth looking at more closely, because on the one side, he gave a verbiage to things Trump would say, like, the need to uphold sovereignty and so forth. So somebody who is not, training himself to read between the lines and understand how this faction fight goes would tend to think that that's what Trump thinks. But what Pompeo said was the total defense of the unipolar world order, which Trump is all out to replace by a completely different system of sovereign states. So, this is the kind of thing where, in my view, neocon persons and forces are trying to somehow, move in such a way that Trump is in a spider web where he can't really do what he wants to do. And the Hollywood spectacle around Bush's funeral, was obviously designed to make people forget who this Bush family is altogether, that it was the Bushes, starting with Prescott Bush supporting Hitler, then the Bush who just died, playing an absolute key role in the prosecution of my husband, then the whole Bush junior and senior and junior wars in the Middle East. So, this is really not a good tradition in America. And we published this book in, I think, the early of the 80s, on early of the 90s, the unauthorized biography of Bush, which people can still buy and read. That will set the record straight. And since the whole spectacle was designed to, count on people's short memory, it's quite worth to read such an absolute in-depth study, which, by the way, in 92, in the Clinton election campaign, in a documentary about Clinton's election campaign, was lying prominently on his desk. Obviously, this book played a role in the defeat of Bush, and therefore people should read it.
I could say more about the Bush funeral, but I won't because it was so disgusting the way it was portrayed. But there was a development, another development, very significant, Helga, along the lines that you had said the politics in the United States have to go. You had said the Democrats are in a situation where if they go with impeachment, they will increase the polarization and destroy both parties in the country. Well, 46 of the newly elected Democrats don't want to go that way, and they are interested in the possibility of working together towards solving things. This letter was just sent out. This is an important step, don't you think?
Oh, yes, absolutely, because these are 46 of the 60 newly elected congressmen, and they say, rather than wasting energies on impeachment against Trump, that there must be a bilateral above-party cooperation to solve real issues like infrastructure, healthcare, job creation, and that they demand that the Democratic leadership takes that up, and they want to meet once a month with that leadership to pursue this direction. So I think that if there could be a cooperation between Trump and the Democrats, as Pelosi also had indicated she would be open to, then you could, in this crisis moment, actually get something done, and the U.S. situation could actually be moved in a different direction. And that is what the Schiller Institute and also our colleagues in the United States from ALPAC, what they are fully mobilized to do. So contact us and work with us, because this is really a pregnant moment. You are in a turmoil. There is not going to be the old order. There's also only going to be the danger of war and chaos, or we quickly move into a new paradigm. And the chances for that are actually extraordinary. So get on board, work with us.
And the three primary issues that these Democrats referred to are issues that are ones that they could work with Trump on. One is better paying jobs. Secondly, infrastructure. And third, healthcare, lowering prescription drug prices and things of that sort. So it is actually begging for the policy of the four laws of LaRouche. And this could become the basis of a collaboration, just as the Four Power Agreement would be the basis of a global New Bretton Woods. Now, on the New Bretton Woods, we see more developments from China. President Xi Jinping has been traveling a little bit recently. Was in Portugal. There are all kinds of developments in Central America. Helga, this is what you're talking about. The Silk Road spirit is catching on everywhere.
Yes, I think it's very important that Portugal is the first European nation which signed an official MOU with China to cooperate on the new Silk Road. And Xi Jinping went there on the way back from the G20, and they not only signed this cooperation agreement, but also 17 other MOUs to work together on trade, on economic cooperation, scientific cooperation. But most importantly, the text of the agreement actually says that China and Portugal will work together on industrial development of Africa and of Latin America. So this is exactly the kind of model which we have been advertising as the way to go to establish new cooperation, but not just on a bilateral level, but to join efforts to solve the urgent problems of those areas of the world which need that kind of intervention, such as many parts of the developing sector. Then you have also, just the dynamic of the Silk Road is continuing. Little Slovakia is now catching up with the broad gauge of the Russian railway system. They're, basically building these systems all the way to China now, linking it up. Then you have also the Silk Road corridor going from Yiwu, a big industrial center near the coast of China, all the way, to Barcelona, to Zaragoza. Another branch is being planned to reach Lisbon. So I think that the pure dynamic of this kind of cooperation is really, on the march forward. And one could only hope, the French situation, for example, it has two ways to go. There is the not so good example of the French Revolution, where a very promising effort to establish a republic, inspired by the creation of America as a young republic, but then, was taken over by the Jacobins, and it ended up with guillotines and, the whole Jacobin terror, leading then to Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars, which naturally led to a big disaster in Europe. So it could go that way. That was what Schiller described. A great moment had found a little people. Or more hopefully, that this French ferment could link up with the desire to cooperate on a new paradigm, to create a completely new system, very much in line with the American system of economy as the young American Republic represented. And, working with Russia, China, the United States, developing Africa, developing the Middle East. So this is a crossroad. So I think, we will see more turmoils. The financial system could come down at any moment. And in that moment, even before, we have to have the 4 laws of LaRouche, and we have to have a new credit system. But, that is not out of the question, but it requires all of you to help us because, we are doing a lot since a very long time. We have presented these ideas. The ideas of LaRouche have affected many parts of the world and are working now in processes which, clearly have been inspired by his work. But now comes the crucial battle. So don't sit on the sidelines, join the Schiller Institute, and let's do everything we can to move the world to be a safer place.
The one beautiful characteristic of a great moment is that the average person can now play a role in changing the future. And we need people to rise up to that occasion. And Helga, thank you very much. We'll see you next week.
I hope so.